We have officially passed the 100 subscriber mark to our newsletter.
That's so cool.
Not awesome? We
I
like
it's so awesome.
totally organic.
It is because we didn't promote it. We didn't do
I mean, we
anything with
did
it.
promote it. We promoted it on Twitter. We didn't do any ads. We didn't like do any paid media for it.
No,
We didn't
I
hire
know, but
anyone to promote it.
I mean, it's not like we pushed it super hard and, like, we only had 1 newsletter go out. I think it was, a good first pass at our first one.
Mhm.
Hopefully, we get more out of it. People start sharing what we talk about and bring value to it, but, you know, it's a huge milestone.
Well,
Like, what's our next one? Like, honestly, what's the next milestone?
let me tell you, the newsletter that or the article in the newsletter
You
that went out had 292 views.
Pretty cool.
And it was received by 89 recipients, which is pretty awesome.
That's
And
awesome.
that's funny because only 89 people are subscribed to it, or more than 89 now,
Yeah, yeah.
103. But the stats on it says that 292, which means that it came from other sources, LinkedIn, Twitter, whatever, whatever, whatever.
So
So
cool.
I just gotta say, like congrats, like we did it,
It's
right?
cool.
We kind of
And
started that.
Hey Designer picked it up, which is pretty cool
Hmm.
too,
Yep, was
right?
featured. Yep.
So hopefully
So
we can start getting picked up and getting cross promotion on this.
mhm.
And I think we have some good topics that we're going to talk about. I mean, interesting. Some are going to be provocative, obviously, right? We
Mhm.
want to challenge status quo. Others are going to be educational. Some are going to be like our point of view. But I think it's going to go along with the podcast we're doing. We're literally doing this for fun. We want to have fun with this, and we want to share our own unique experiences along the way because I think we have a lot to offer. We've done a lot, we've seen a lot. So I think it's a matter of bringing our whole self to the table and being like
Mhm.
as transparent as we can.
Yeah, and I think it's funny you said that because other people also have newsletters that recommend us, and one that actually does recommend us the most so far is Ravi's system design newsletter, which I think is great because it
No
kind of
way.
ties into our topic of the day. But yeah, so
What?
shout out to Ravi. So he sent over a bunch of people just from his newsletter. They sign up for his, they kind of go to
That's so cool.
ours. So that was really cool. Thanks, Ravi.
Thank you. Big props to you, man.
Yeah, we'll send you a nice thank you note or something soon. But speaking of which, his is about designing systems or system design, and we want to talk a little bit about today design systems.
Yeah, I think it was like we chatted a lot about things, and you and I had obviously chances to work in big design
Let's
systems,
talk about
small
that.
design
So
systems.
talk about your background in design systems first before we get into it.
Yeah, I was working before IBM. I was working at what used to be a startup, but was acquired by like Warner Media for like 100 mil. So it was like a big success story. But we were building apps and software with like, and I was dabbling with what design systems were, right? It was like design systems were starting, people were starting to create components, repetitive elements. And then when I got to IBM, they were starting to introduce carbon. Like they had tried to make many different
Carbon being what?
carbon design system. I'll get to it.
Hmm.
And they were starting to get trying to align the company and be IBM being like it has like 360,000 employees or something, trying to get them to align on this unique vision, style, aesthetic, and whatnot. It always failed. I was told at one point it's because they didn't have the right people to push it and the right vision behind it. And then when I came along, and not that I set everything straight, but it's just while I was there, they were starting to implement the carbon design system. And one thing I think that really played a big value in this, and there's two points I would say, or two main drivers in all this. I mean, Micah Bink had an amazing vision. What he did with the design language was fantastic, right? I think he really pushed the design language, the typeface, the colors, how
Yep.
everything worked together very solidly. And then there was also Aaron who pushed really hard from an executive level to sell it across and sell the vision of design. Obviously, it was us pushing it bottom up across the board and doing the work that we did. But that was my first pass at a real big ass design system. And I've played with a lot of other design systems within, the design field and whatnot, I still think IBM is one of the strongest design systems
Mhm,
for what it does. I mean, I mean, there's pros and cons, don't get me wrong, but I mean, for enterprise level, I still think it's very strong and solid and it's consistent. You can definitely identify an IBM product now by looking at it,
mhm.
right? The language is that strong. Like we'll talk about later about like pros and cons of
Yeah.
systems, but if we just stick to the facts, this is strong. I mean, that was like, that was my first take on it. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. I started out on a team that was using a different design system. So IBM,
Mhm.
for those who don't know, many years ago had this initiative to kind of push design as a key element, key differentiator across all business units. And that was, I think, Jenny Remedi's big push,
You
and I think probably the best thing she's done for the company because it actually set the company eventually into revenue, so or
you
profiting, and that's
you
amazing. And so she handed off the reins
yeah,
to Arvind, right? And I think that now it's on a good trajectory, but it became essential. Design became essential as the key differentiator and
yeah,
the element that actually shifted the focus onto users and consider them more in the process of building these products for scale to make money. So I think that was a big success. But when I was actually in this kind of mess, I kind of joined right when a team was kind of falling apart. They didn't really have a grip on the design system at all, or a design system. Every unit had their own design system, and
you
then every team had their own design system, and then every squad in that had their own design system. And they were using things like spec sheets, where basically you had like a page of all the different key elements, like a button, a drop
yep,
down, whatever, but they're all kind of on the same page with no guidance, no written guidance about how do you use this, when should you use this. It was just there. That's how most of the teams were kind of behaving at that time. Some had more developed stuff, and there was a couple of design systems that were challenging Carbon as the rivals for like what should be the final
you
design system for IBM. Carbon ended up having the most in it and being used the most for some of the products. So they, I guess, went up with that eventually as the strategy, which was a great strategy because it did work out in the end. But we were part of a different design system,
you
and that design system was a mess. And I had to help with Gentry Baird, one of my dear friends, kind of clean up a little bit about that and kind of use that to help that team and that product and that part of the company
you
succeed. Now, right after we launched the product with that design system we fixed up, I had the opportunity, cross-referencing all the different teams, to get the go-ahead to create a sketch kit that would enable all of our teams to use the same components within the same kind of organization, so within analytics platform, essentially.
you
And so I went out of my way to create a sketch component library, and it was the very first widely used sketch component library at IBM. And that ended up actually leading me to working directly with Carbon, to helping them to help guide them a little bit on how should they structure the future of Carbon's design systems in Sketch, which then eventually converted to Figma and Sketch and to all other tools, Adobe, whatever. So it's funny that I actually helped shape the design system in the structural way in
you
the actual day-to-day life of designers, and then kind of saw it grow after that. Obviously, I didn't have that much to do with the strategy overall, but you and I actually ended up collaborating on many different pieces of this design system. And I don't think it's necessary to get into every single detail about that, but why don't we kind of now break down a little bit more about what is a design system? Why is it important?
yeah, I think it's definitely not a Figma component library.
Yeah.
That it is not,
So
because
what is it not? Let's start with that. What is it not?
it's not a too many people think that once it's in Figma, oh, that's a design system. No, that's like a set of components.
Hmm.
Like that's basically what it is. It's it's not the ceiling, because I find too many people use a design system as like, oh, I can't do more than that. I drop it in, I can't, like, I can't. That's where it stops. I think you can continuously push a design system because it
Hmm.
evolves. So
Or
it's not
or
a Figma.
they also say, oh, somebody else already did that. I can't modify it because it's already there.
Mhm. Yeah, like there's a lot of groundbreaking things that
Hmm.
people stop. So it's definitely not that Figma library thing. It's, you know, I think it's harder to talk about what it is not than, because you you kind of see it when you work, right? People all of a sudden like grab it and they won't contribute anything back. Like they modified it, but they don't contribute it back. So it just
Mhm.
starts to
Fracture.
diverge, and it becomes like this useless thing at the end because nobody's using it. So it's like it's not just a design tool. It's not just a marketing tool. It's not just, a coded element. It's this whole ecosystem that should
Mhm.
live together, right? It my humble opinion is it starts from the design language, which kind of trickles down and creates like this
Mhm.
design system, which then goes into the components and
Well
whatnot. So
but what's your definition for design? I have a definition that's like a work in progress, whatever, but what is your definition then of a design system, since this is the design system episode?
definition, phew, I didn't come up with a
Okay,
definition.
so then I'll say what I think. So I think you nailed it when you said the word ecosystem.
Yeah.
I think it's an ecosystem of solutions that are ever evolving,
Right.
address needs of users
Mhm.
and interactions to the technology that they're using, and
Mhm.
stakeholders that are building the technology.
It is. And it's a bit further than just
Oh,
reusable
I said it was a
components and
work in
guidelines.
progress. Well, I mean, like,
No,
yeah, like it starts out broad, right? So
mhm,
then more of the design systems that we focus on are digital,
yeah.
right? So they're involving UI elements, so elements on the computer, elements on the
Mhm,
phone that are like buttons and like I said, search inputs and drop downs and text
mhm,
fields and radio buttons. These are all kind of pieces of a design system,
mhm,
but a
mhm.
design system is more than just these pieces. It's the written guidance that's behind these
It is.
elements. It's the reasoning. It's the back and forth conversations. It's the documentation that brings to light how
Mhm.
something should exist and how it could be evolved in the future.
Yeah, it's like the tone of voice, like because a lot of people think that once you have like a component definition, oh, my design system is done, right? I think the most important output of a design system is really the design itself, actually, right? It's usually about bridging the gap around the design intent. And I think
Hmm.
that's the goal
Yeah.
because the design system should inevitably go across all customer touch point. So marketing, branding, component, product, like that's where your design system, if done correctly, is going to be used,
Hmm.
not just at the UI level.
Yeah.
That's when you know your design system is very powerful and very well executed because all customer touch points are consistent, they're cohesive, same tone
Hmm.
of voice, they're attacking it from the same way.
Now, why is that considered design system but not design language?
To me, a design language is more of the feeling you're trying to sell. Not It's not like the component level. The
Like
language
branding? It involves branding.
branding is part of the design language, but it's not like the design language sort of supersedes everything in my point of view. It's like that's the brand ethos. That's
Okay.
the To
So
me,
it's
that's like
yeah.
my language part of how I perceive
Mhm.
all these things. And branding, well, it's like the logo usage, colors, fonts, typography, like how motion is going to be played into this, like all that. It's all a big puzzle piece that all fit together, obviously. But if we
Mhm.
break them out individually, they're going to
So
be a bit differently.
so would you say that like the design language is like the puzzle itself,
You,
and then like the puzzle pieces are like, for example, many of them can be part of the design system,
you,
many of them can be part of the marketing system. I guess there's systems that are oriented around solving problems through a certain intent that
you,
already have solutions behind them, so you don't have to reinvent the solution every time.
we should, right? I think it's
We should reinvent the solution every time,
no,
or
no, 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 no. Yeah, we should. You're right. It's like that.
okay,
That's how we should approach it or think
okay.
it, because I think it's a lot of people, and it kind of ties back to what we were saying, what they are, what they are not. I don't think they're really popular now because a lot of people see it as efficient, speed to market, delivery, consistency, but the majority of reasons, like people don't use them correctly, or they like.
Why don't they use them correctly?
I think unfortunately, not unfortunately, designers are creative. They always want to be creative. So when they see something out of the design system, sometimes they're going to say, well, that doesn't work for me. I'm going to do it this way.
Okay, so
So,
I'm gonna pin you right there and kind of hold the rest of the thought. So you're kind of implying that a design system has constraints, right? And that many designers feel that they don't want to work in those constraints and that they can kind of adjust their designs to be more original and not reusable from the design system. And you're saying that that's something that's a problem and they're not using it correctly, right?
I think it's a problem, but it's also a problem that comes with a design system. You
Okay.
need to understand, like, there's disadvantages and advantages, right? I mean, depending on the size of the company, you can't continuously reinvent the wheel for every UX problem you face. You got to depending again on the size of the company, enterprise or not. I think there's going to be pros and cons for both. I think one of the problems people usually have is they don't cross pollinate or try to see what somebody else inside their own product. I'm not even going to know numerous products, just inside their own product space. They're not going to ask if somebody's already solved that same problem before. They're going to go in their own bubble or silo and just continuously reinvent the wheel. So inside the same product,
Mhm.
what often happens is you have three mental model approaches on how to do the same solution because people are not talking. Like
Mhm.
that's one of the big problems I'm seeing. Even if they're using a design system, they're going to create like a flow, which somebody else already created in the same product, but they're going to approach it differently. So it's not the design system's fault per se, but it's more of a communicational aspect of things. Often that is the barrier to entry, and people often blame the system, saying it's limiting. It is. I mean, don't get me wrong, especially people that are like more purists in a say, like in from a design point of view, a design system can feel like it's a stop, right? It can't be more creative than what it is. But if you approach it from, if you're working in enterprise software, you can't reinvent the wheel every time because you got to think of your end users. Your end users may be just bought your products. They're going to they've just made a commitment for 5 years and they have end users. They can't relearn the product every time. So I think you got to think about it a bit more up instead of if you're just building one app. I think
Mhm.
there's like a differences of enterprise to app to smaller scale to web design. I think that's where the advantages and disadvantages could easily come.
And yeah, so I think a really cool aspect you highlighted was that it's kind of like almost like an overview. You have to step back and kind of see like a bird's eye view of
Yes.
all the other things that are happening in the same kind of space, not necessarily the same, discourse that you're having with the customers, but the same kind of solutions that you're applying.
Mhm.
If you see someone else has something that you and I worked on very closely, data tables or tables, right? So many people know this from other products, but you know, some products have these things called tables where you have a bunch of rows of data and you can filter them, you can kind of sort them, organize them. You can kind of, select things, delete them,
Yeah.
highlight text, drill down, whatever. You and I worked on kind of leading the effort with Marion, of
Mhm.
course, who, we all kind of worked together on how can we bridge the gaps between our products and how somebody interacts with this type of component. And within our product, Watson Studio, we had a bajillion ways tables were being used,
Mhm.
let alone the other parts of, the department and how all of us should then kind of collide together and say, all right, so when interact with the table this way, it does this thing. And this rule is what we should use. And let's debate why we should use this rule over this rule. And then once we have a conclusion, we can then help, create guidance, tell the developers how it should be, interacted with by the user side, and then we have that conversation with them, make sure everything's okay, and then they
Mhm.
end up shipping that, and we all adopt it, right?
Yeah.
So I think that without it, a lot of chaos ensues. A lot of time gets wasted. A lot of money gets spent on solving things that are already solved, or could ultimately impact the bottom line of a major company or and even a small startup.
Good.
You know, so I want to go quickly into those kind of pieces, and then we'll dive into kind of like why it's really becoming a now like a big thing in like design industry. It's like almost like trendy to be doing a design system. So if you're not using a design system, it can be detrimental in many ways. Number one, like I mentioned before, time, right? If you're spending time building a solution that's already been built in that company, you're wasting development time and you're wasting designer time and even, product management time too, figuring out how to roadmap and scale these kind of things into production. And that causes a lot of other issues, like, for example, spending more money. You pay these
Yeah.
people to do, a task, and then at the end of the day, if that task has already been done, what are you doing? You're kind of wasting your money and wasting your time, and it's not very efficient.
Yep.
But you also don't know if there is a better solution that's been tried and true that kind of solves all the intents that that experience that you're trying to
Mhm.
implement requires. So if you have a button, maybe the button has, a drop down attached to it or something, or,
Yep.
it opens up a modal specifically. What if sometimes that experience needs to be a little bit different, but it
Mhm.
has the same basic interactions? Well, instead of building a whole new experience, just kind of add a variant to that experience
Yeah.
and document that, share that, debate that, right? So there's so many things that design system is actually really good for business wise.
Yeah.
And, you can also see how it has improved the business. You actually can measure the impact of a design system, and I'll give you an example of that, and then we'll jump over to the other thing. We're trying to integrate one product into Watson Studio, and what was so cool about that is, because we help define the design system and build the components that they already need to use, the patterns in which somebody was able to interact with it and understand how to use the product before the product was ever used by them, right? It's
Yep.
like without you don't really need onboarding, you kind of already know how to use it based on other products that they've used. It saved them 11 months of development time. So that actually got us to market faster, right?
Mhm.
Got that product into the market faster, integrated into the same system that we're all using, and saved the devs a bunch of time, right? Then now more people can use the product, but also it wasn't that much of a big deal to actually implement the product. They had all the things built for them. They had all the solutions
Yep.
that, 50% of the solutions are already pre-made for them. So it does actually work, and you can measure this in your own companies. But let's jump into, why do you think this is becoming so prominent in our industry?
I think it's like from what I'm seeing and from what I've like our previous work
Mhm.
after IBM, where you and I got a chance to work together again, from me consulting with like ex colleagues of mine that I'm helping them in their startup or with a bigger company where they're trying to merge everything. I think people see this as the trend. It's like it's going to speed up design. It's going to be more efficient. It's going to. I'm. I think it's about trying to be speed to market. I think that's definitely a thing that people see. They see
Okay.
it's like less time coding, less time designing, less time we can work on bigger problems. That's I think what's been sold. I think that's why within Figma they have like these Figma tokens. They have everything right. That it, like I said, design systems we could spend like weeks on because it's so wide. But I think that's my point of view as to why people are going. Should everybody do it? No, not honestly. Like if you have 7 products that have 7 individual brands, forcing it may actually cost more than keeping 7 different design systems and moving forward with it
Mhm.
and slowly chipping away at it. I think people are trying to force things that don't necessarily go together, unfortunately. And
So some companies are just doing it because other companies are doing it, but they're not considering their specific needs, or at least figuring out how best to solve it for their company.
I I think so. And like I've had conversations where with an ex-colleague of mine, I'm trying to help her get, design systems rolling forward, trying to digest and dissect what the VP is trying to tell in that point of view. And I'm not saying that's going to be the solution or not, but it seems like
Mm,
I don't necessarily see that it has to be forced inside. Like
mhm.
I don't think it necessarily has to be forced within a design system. They have like 7 brands and 7 individual brands, like totally different logo, different color scheme, different everything. They want to have one design system. It's going to be hard because you have to consider one, the different tech stacks like
Mhm.
code, the colors, the fonts. And, we tried to
Well,
approach
the
it,
brand, the brand of each product, right?
the brand exactly. And I know tokens can help, but at the same
Or
time,
can you explain a little bit real quick what tokens are?
well, yeah, it's a good point. I mean, tokens are, it's basically like a coded, and I'm not a developer, so I'm going to try to make it as simple as they can. But it's basically it's this coded value that you can say like button primary as the name of it. And just by changing the X code value of it, you could automatically pick up.
Okay.
How can I frame it? No, you
Okay.
frame it
Let
best.
me let me try. It's the most basic element in a design system, a token,
Yeah,
right? It's interchangeable. It can no longer be manipulated from a kind of hierarchical perspective. It
you
is
should not. It
you,
can
you
be.
should well, you should not, which is why I would say it cannot, because if you do manipulate it, then you're just adding more to the design system. It's
Yes.
actually not the system. It's just creating a bunch of options as
Yeah.
opposed to variants. And I'll get to that in a second. But I think it's at the core of it, it's the most basic value that you can apply to something from the perspective of a key piece of graphic design. So there's icons, type,
Mhm.
spacing, color, and there's many more other companies might even come up with, and I'm sure you can come up with 100 more. But they're the most basic things that are the building blocks for everything else. So you can have combinations of them to create other elements, and this is then goes into this idea of the atomic design structure, right?
Yeah.
So it starts off with these, atoms, which are the tokens, and the tokens are like the
Yep.
defining things that build everything up. So type, you have like, a word, but if you wanted to make it into a button, then you add a container around it, right? So that's a
Mhm.
color, right? Or gradient, whatever, whatever era of design you live in. So if, it has those two elements, then you have a new thing called a component, which is built on top of atoms or tokens.
Mhm.
So that's what I would describe tokens to be. And then it kind of builds up from there. You can say that, this it goes from atoms to what is it, molecules like buttons and inputs, to then like components, which are a little bit more complex, to whatever. But generally there's just like a base level, and then there's a combination of those base levels.
Okay, let's stick with your definition. But I'd like to add too is that when using tokens across the board, if a company decides to change the brand color of primary from yellow to purple, I don't know why they would make that big change, but anyways, it would be adopted
Hmm.
across the board.
Yep.
If everybody uses tokens correctly, and I say correctly because oftentimes developers are going to override the token.
Hmm.
If they do it correctly, everybody's going to consume the changes for free.
Hmm.
Oftentimes, right?
I've
I'm not going to
never
say
I've never seen actually huge changes take place, just out of my own experience. I've never
I know.
seen like you've actually used it for that. I know that's the like one purpose of them, but I've never seen that take place because they always end up just starting from scratch again.
Yes, I
That's
know.
just a note that a weird thing I've noticed. Like,
I think we haven't been through the change after tokens have been implemented.
no, I've seen, well, okay, so I've seen people change tokens, but it's never like a a huge reason to change it from blue to purple like that. I don't think that would ever happen generally. It could, but
But you
generally
say
when you
that if you think of like within your product, if you went from light to dark, that was token changing.
I guess what I'm saying is like when I've seen it happen, it's like they used the wrong blue instead of like, whatever
Yeah.
the hex code is for like the color, they missed it by like one number. So it's like just like a weird glitch. It's a bug more than anything. That's usually what I've seen them be used for, to adjust the bugs, as opposed to actually changing the whole experience. Now, what's cool about it, I think from more of a development perspective, is that yes, I guess that would be more applicable to the development where you are changing a token and then act like, for example, the font, right? So if you change a heading of one of
Yep.
the tokens to a new
Yep.
font, yes. So I've seen that happen before from Helvetica to Plex, at IBM.
Yep.
Those are two different typefaces for those who aren't listening, or who are listening but who don't know. But you know, I've never seen them go from a wildly different
Yeah.
experience. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's because we haven't gone through a change like that significant. Maybe IBM next year is going to say, you know what, we're going to brand ourselves as Red Hat and then just use everything red and then change all the blues to red. I don't think that'll happen, but theoretically it can happen. I just never seen it on the design side. Now on the development side, it happens every year, right? That change
Yeah.
constantly happens. They have to figure out how to maintain, swap those things out, and they have other, web frameworks that allow them to do that more easily. But I don't think it's actually very easy ever for development. I
Yeah.
feel bad for developers that, we can't just be the ones that plug into the things that they've set and then just kind of adjust it for them instead of them doing it themselves. And maybe there's a tool in the future that lets us do that. But as of now, I've never seen a designer have to go through and swap out the basics of a token, which is what they could be doing. That's what one of the purposes for them. But I just wanted to say
Yeah.
that was my point of disagreement.
No, no, and it's great perspective, and I think that's why I mean, we've had the chance to work with numerous design systems, et cetera, and that's why, like, it's
Mhm,
such a long topic to cover, and, like, this is high level topic that we're covering. I think we're gonna be able to dive in a bit deeper in, like, guilds and contribution and
mhm,
things like that in other episodes.
mhm,
But I'd like to like, what's your point on do you consider, like, design systems mandatory?
mhm.
Do you think we'll get to a point where design like, everybody should be using a design system, small or big or not? Like, what's your 2 cents on this?
I think that it depends on what your goal is, not just your intent. Your intent is to design something that that makes sense for users to use, that's easy to use, that's consistent, blah 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 blah. That's pretty much basic levels of intent that are just generally good for good design, right? Like if you don't have the basic principles of design,
Mhm,
usability, consistency, discoverability, whatever, then you're kind of making it harder for your experience to grow,
mhm,
but also for people to experience it correctly and to its
yeah,
full potential. So that's number one. I said goal, right? And I kind of I'm defining intent as like the precursor to what you're doing as like just a
yes,
general understanding. But the goal that you are optionally setting, I think it depends because if you're a startup and like I know a startup and they're trying to build a product, but this product they're building, they were already given a broken design system and they're just kind of
mhm,
using the components in it without actually using any guidance. There's no guidance written in it, so it's not really a design system, it's just like a spec sheet. They need to create some consistency to make it easy for somebody to understand across the board. So I'd recommend maybe there be like a soft design system. So maybe
mhm,
that is like the spec sheet. At least you have some
it is,
degree of consistency and not consistency for the sake of consistency, consistency for the sake of users understanding how to use something the same way everywhere that thing's being propagated. Otherwise, you kind of change it to adjust to the context. And I wrote an article about this, and we can actually post that in the description later. We'll also talk about that in another episode, I think.
mhm,
But during our contribution model, episode
mhm,
or whatever. But I do think that every team should have a design system. It's just how can that be easy enough to not invest a lot of time in for the goal you have set? Or is the goal really that you need to have a lot of time in
yeah,
it to, let me rephrase that. It depends on the goal though in the end because if you're trying to rush to build something fast, then you're not gonna have enough time to document and then build out the design system.
yes,
But if you also have a lot of time and you're moving a little bit slower, and you actually are trying to create a structural change that then will propel a business or a startup or an app forward, then it would be to your advantage to invest time in the design system. So I would say the answer is yes, but it determines how much investment you want to put into it and how big you want it to be. So just like a soft design system toward like a really in-depth, detailed, a lot of guidance and a lot of examples and code and whatever version of that would be.
yeah, I agree. I think the goal is important and the size of what you're trying to build is important as well, because a Figma component library can be enough for what you're
Mhm.
trying to achieve, right? If
Yeah.
you're enterprise, obviously is not because you need it includes so many designers, so many variables, so many rules and whatnot. So I think this is
Mhm.
different. So I agree on that point. I think they're going to evolve. I think I almost kind of see like my future point of it is going to become multidisciplinary. It won't just be based on the product designer, like the UI designer. I think it's something that could potentially scale, right? It won't just be like digital product designers or developers. I kind of see things shifting a bit into like marketing, org designers, industrial designers, and so on, so that it becomes this way of thinking. And like if you start to systemize elements, what can be repeated, what can be so I think a systems design is going to be a bit broader than
Mhm.
just pixel work at one point. I think if we do it right, but it's always going to be with the intent. Is it always going to be easy? No, because it involves so many people. I think the right stakeholders need to be involved. I think like the goals and it's just it's such a hard thing to sell. And if the people are not aligned on it, it won't succeed. Like oftentimes, like it's hard to get a design system at scale in if the right people are not involved.
I want to touch on that point real quick, but before that, I would actually push back a little bit on what you said about, it's going to infiltrate other areas that are not digital design oriented, like architecture, for example. I think that that's already, I think it's actually where we get it from. Because if you think about how architectures probably plan out the structure of something, they have to know how much they need, how much like materials they need, and what they can do to reuse it so they don't have to create more production, I guess, differentiations of elements. So that they don't, if they have like metal, are they going to cut the pieces into multiple sizes and widths, heights and whatever? Or are they going to cut them to as many of the same sizes as possible to save on money, save on time, that, you don't have to reorient the machinery. So I think that other disciplines actually already had this. We're pulling it from the past of that production line a little bit. And I think that's something that we'll eventually need to address is like, okay, now that we have this beautiful production that executes something really well, how do we allow it to thrive and grow and not just be stale and kind of fade over time? Because I know we mentioned before in the beginning of this episode about creativity and how somebody can add to it, but also try new things, not just, slightly modify something. Sometimes you have to reinvent some aspects. Like
Agree.
Apple does this every year or so. They'll have like a paradigm for how something works, but then they'll reinvent how they can do it better. And they'll start with one app, and then that app will then trickle that experience across the board
You,
to other apps. Like, for example, the swiping from left to right to kind of moving the page over instead of clicking the back button. That was implemented in one of the operating system updates. And
you,
then that infiltrated all the other
yep.
experiences because it was already built into the code, which then, luckily was able to just be put everywhere. But other things might be a little different, like how things slide into the screen,
Yep.
modal slide in, and then that had to be built in differently for every other app that might have actually not used it very well. So I don't actually remember the second question you had to that before I went on that weird long
No,
rant.
but I agree with what you just said. And it's almost when it's done correctly and intentionally, it's frictionless because people don't realize Apple does use a system, right? I think they do it in a way that it's so frictionless we don't even notice it.
hmm Yeah, and I think that, to be honest, their sketch kit that they help, I think Sketch and Apple worked on a kit together that kind of,
Yeah.
it's one of the templates part of it, part of the app, and I think that they'll eventually work on a Figma one or whatever. I don't think that they currently have one for Figma, which are, for those who are listening who don't know, Sketch and Figma are both tools that we use in our daily work. And I think that the Apple one is so complex and so confusing, their designs or their spec system really inside Sketch, that I actually don't like using it. I'd rather just use wireframes, and then when the time comes, just run it
Yeah.
at build time and then see what it looks like and then just kind of adjust it and then go there from there. I've never actually been able to successfully work on the intricacies of a multi-mobile operating design system. I've only focused mostly on the web and desktop versions of
Yeah.
a design system. But I do have, you and I have, I think, disagreements on a little bit on how those should kind of play out as well. But I don't know if we want to get into that right now or get into
Nah,
another
way too
episode.
complex.
Yeah.
But I think like I know they updated their interface guidelines, like Apple, and it's really thorough. The thing I don't like about it, there's not enough images. Like it's so text heavy.
Yeah,
Like the
I
new
actually don't think it's thorough at all because of the images. I think that the
no, but what I mean is
images,
like it's
yeah.
really super text heavy, and
Yeah,
I'd
yeah.
love for it to be okay. Show me, like, what do you? I
Mhm.
read
Yeah.
it, but can you show me visually what you're talking about? And I think that's something that I dislike about the new system and the updated version of it.
When that new one got released, I think last year, or you think the year before that, maybe, or maybe it was this year. No, it was
You,
definitely last year. Could be wrong. I saw so many designers online simping for the people who were creating it and like tweeting at them, "Oh my god, love the design system! Like great work!" Like yeah, sure, okay, like you should, give credit where due, and I think
Yeah.
that there's a lot of really great written content, but I cannot find anything quickly. I have to
Mm,
read an entire page just to understand one sentence.
yeah.
No, that's ridiculous. I should be able to scan it quickly. I think it's one problem with it. If you're not able to quickly scan a design system and go in and get out what you need, then it's not a very successful design system. And their human interface guidelines are even beyond a design system. They're really about human interaction with technology.
Yeah.
And the fact that they don't have images and yet all their keynotes have just they're plastered with images. There's like no
Ugh,
text on the screen, right?
and they're
It's
such
such
a
a
visual company.
mhm.
That's the thing I don't get. It feels like the system doesn't connect with everything else that they do.
It's so bizarre. It almost is like they outsourced it, but I know they didn't. I don't think they outsourced it. I think they definitely kept it
And
in company.
where
But
does the orange come from?
the orange, what orange?
And the this design system, like on the human guidelines.
Oh, you mean like the Apple Watch orange?
No, it's like, don't they have like an orange in there where the like the
Yeah.
Apple
So
human?
so
Yeah.
the Apple Watch uses on the button on the side, the hardware and also like some of the software. It uses a color called International Orange, which they used for the Apple Watch, and then they added it to the system, I guess, because the Apple Watch is now being like the new one, the like Pro
Yeah.
version or whatever you call it. That one is actually used for extreme sports and extreme kind of like situations like deep diving and climbing mountains and stuff. So they used it to kind of create the sense of like this is more of a utility for your
Yeah.
safety and whatever and it's kind of like a cool like branding aspect that they
Yep.
added to it and I like how they kind of went with it. Although I don't love the color orange itself, but the sentiment of it being international orange I think was a better move to go with that than picking their own orange. I think it was just a much smarter choice because they, like, have this whole story behind it, and that kinda tells more about the product than just, like, arbitrary design decisions, because they had a story that was linking it's like, "Oh, this actually is, like, coming from, like, the NASA, like, the space shuttle has, like, international orange, that's why it's international," right? It's like, whatever, everyone around the world uses this type of orange for, like, cool things, whatever, like, there's special use cases for it. So they used it for it, but other than that particular instance, every other decision is hidden behind a wall of text in their
Yes.
guidelines. And their guidelines used to be very example heavy with visual,
Mm.
mock-ups of the iPhone stuff. And I remember the very first one that I got to see of the iPhone human interface guidelines. For those who don't know what HIG stands for, human interface guidelines, they're defined usually by Apple and then usually copies them because no one's doing the research that they're doing except, the big four companies, right? Facebook, Google, Microsoft, whatever, they come up with their own guidelines because they have a lot of research backing it too. And you don't have to have like a lot of like sciencey people in like a room with like white coats testing humans how big is their finger touch when it touches the screen, you know, which is 44 points by the way, for
Yep.
those who don't know. Apple, kind of announced that. It's funny because, you and I work on design systems. We user testing that we get to do every day through interviews, through hearing feedback from users and kind of changing things and kind of putting it out there and
Mm.
seeing how they feel and having that kind of testing be conducted. Whereas a lot of other companies that have a lot of more money and a lot more resources, like Apple, they actually have devices that are built for testing specific things like how big is the touch, like how can you calculate that size of the finger touching the screen, because it's not the full finger, it's just kind of the touch of the little bit of the skin, but it's not one dot, right? It's not one pixel. So it's interesting how some come up with those solutions. But I think in the recent years, especially after iOS 7, Apple went off the deep end and they kind of went more aesthetic as opposed to actually
Yep.
human interface,
Yeah.
like interaction. And that made me really sad, especially because their products ended up getting a little bit worse in usability. And then they've gotten back up. They're going back up again, but it's not the same as when it was before. And yeah, you're kind of probably doing different things, but I don't know if the trade off was successful or not. I think that it opened up a whole new window of experiences that I think were really cool. I think we only know how to use them because other things use them, not because they're inherently easy to use, right? Like my parents still can't use some apps or websites because the interactions are just so foreign to them. And I think that's okay. That the goal was to get like the whole world onboarded to this kind of technology and then move it towards something that's a little bit more natural when you're actually using it, but you have to learn it a little bit. I'm
Completely.
not sure how to balance that, to be honest, as a company like Apple.
No, it's good. I agree. You said I think there's a lot of changes that happen with all this, but I don't know why. I don't know if it's positive or not within that time frame.
I guess
So
we'd
so
have
like
to.
what's your final take on it? Like on systems, yay or nay?
My final take on design systems.
Yeah.
I mean, sure. What?
No, but I mean, is like, do you obviously see value in it,
Yeah.
but should everybody use it or not? Or okay, let me frame it.
I think everyone should be considerate about how they're designing and how that plays into a greater system that
Mhm.
can scale and grow, but at the right time.
Yes. I think my point, yeah, I think it's pissing the right, choosing the right opportunity to inject it or use it. Because I think sometimes you can fake it until you make it in a sense that you can colorize everything to look the same, behave the same, doesn't have to
Yeah.
consume the code right away. So I think there's advantages and disadvantages of doing that. But I think it's to your point, it's all about the end goal. I think that's what I want to end with on this is I think you should all of these questions about systems or not, like what's the end goal out of it?
Mhm.
And I think consistency is super important because obviously cognitive load for users and things like that when they're navigating your product, they shouldn't have to relearn every page if they're using the same element or the same patterns. I think those are things that need to be taken into consideration, but there's also costs. Sometimes it costs too much to go back and update the old code.
Mhm.
It's better off to just implement a design system in the new pages or net new
Mhm.
designs as you move forward and retrofit as you start changing previous designs. So yeah, I think there's many advantages to it, especially when you're designing at scale, especially for enterprise. I think for small companies, I don't know. I think there's sometimes Figma could be okay.
Agreed.
We agree on something.
Yeah, okay, cool. So, I think that that's a good wrap up for episode 8 on design systems. And then I
I
guess in the
agree.
future, we'll have a lot more episodes on design systems because it's like there's actually podcasts that are dedicated just to design systems.
I
So I think
know.
that it's enormous and we're just scratching the surface here and I think that we'll have a lot more to say soon.
Yeah, I agree. And I think just the fact that we were able to at IBM design at that scale and velocity, I think there's a lot we've learned. And I think there's a lot that we can share on that point.
Heck yeah. Cool. All right.
Awesome.
Thanks, man.
Peace.